Okay, I guess we'll get started because I'm not sure when people are going to straggle in. I guess first off, any questions or confusions? Um, I know Kahana had you'd wondered whether what you should do with the Palolo stuff. Just send that to me. For some reason, you guys sometimes have access to the folder and sometimes don't. So just send your materials that you've collected to me. If you've got a lot and it's sort of parsed out, then just do a Google Drive folder and send it to me and give me access to it. And then I'll put it in. I'll put it in the shared drive. So yeah, it's sort of clunky, but I'm not sure what happened with that. But so yeah, just send me your information, your data, and I'll input it into the folder for you. Let's see.
I submit it into Canvas. Is that okay? Or should I just email it to you?
Oh, Canvas is fine. Canvas will work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Either way. Yeah, it's just for some reason, I don't know why, but all I can think is maybe is the number of people that have access to the folder. All of a sudden, it just decided that it didn't want you guys loading stuff into it. You can still see it, but you can't put stuff in. So I just didn't know how to get around that. So it's just easier to do it this way for now. I'll figure it out over the break.
Professor, I had a
Sure.
question before we started.
Yeah.
For the Pololo evaluation due tonight, how long did you want our paper to be?
Oh, okay. Yeah, good question. Basically, I just want you to evaluate, well, first, what did you do? And then what value did it have, if any, in terms of understanding the class material? Because since it's service learning, the project's supposed to help you get some insight into, geography of Hawaii. If it did, if it didn't, how, and what recommendations would you have? I mean, one obviously that I have is we've got to figure out an easier way to get people to get access to the folder. So some technical issues, but yeah, just in general, how, if at all, did this help you understand or appreciate the course material?
Okay.
So it could be fairly short, a couple of paragraphs probably.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Let's see what else. I guess that's pretty much it. Oh yeah. Just to reiterate, because I mentioned a couple of times before, remember that on all of what you guys were doing, you might have come up in situations where you were looking stuff and you couldn't find it. Be sure and remember that that's actually a really key part of this is what you looked at that you didn't have any luck with is just as important as what you were able to find. Some reason people have a hard time. That's not the way we usually teach stuff in the academia, where you have to find things. But it's in real research, as you guys have probably found out, a lot of times you look for stuff and you don't see it. It should be there, but it isn't. Someone was looking at agricultural guides by the state and found there was nothing out there. If you're going to be a farmer, the state doesn't give you anything, any help at all, which I find sort of mind-blowing, but now we know. We didn't know that before. So, writing down, I spent 10 or 15 hours looking for this and I couldn't find it. That's just as legit as what you found. And that gives us insight because that's actually going to be part of what the project is areas where things aren't that should be there. Because the eventual purpose is to build up a portfolio of things to help folks in Palolo and neighboring neighborhoods in terms of what's available and what isn't, and also to a certain extent sort of poke the county and the state that you guys should be providing this and that and you haven't. So, that's the closest parallel I can think of is you're not used to doing research, it'd be like investigative reporting. But this is, you guys are doing basic research. And so what you don't see or what you thought was going to be there and wasn't is just as legitimate as what you actually came up with. So always remember that don't worry. As long as you spent the time looking for things, don't worry if you didn't find it, because what you didn't find, if it was supposed to be there, is just as important. That's something I constantly have to remind people because they're used to, you got to have deliverables. But remember that something that doesn't exist, if you've looked for it, is actually in a weird way a deliverable. So just remember that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, let me get started on this stuff. I'm going to finish up for the semester. First off is, again, because I'm in this stuff, I see it, probably I don't see the forest for the trees type thing. It's important to remember that if you go back to 2002, 2004, even 2005, in other words, what, 15 years ago, DBED, which is Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. So that's the state agency that's responsible for tourism. Just to get equally complicated, there's also the Hawaii Tourism Authority, which is funded by the legislature, which is responsible for promoting tourism. But the two are different. The two usually work together because they sort of see the world in the same way, but they're actually different entities. But basically, if you looked at either of those two groups up till 2005, they sort of came up with a shared understanding of what tourism was going to be here in Hawaii. Tourism at the time was still mass tourism, was starting to change. There was this whole drive for authenticity. There had been enormous pressure back in the 90s to develop more, quote, authentic Hawaiian experience. So there's actually a training center down in Waikiki which trains people in the hospitality industry into how to use Hawaiian words and how to understand Hawaiian concepts. I've got some of their PDFs, but to be honest, I didn't even bother loading them for you guys. So there's actually stuff out there. So, you know, you learn when it's supposedly appropriate to use the word mahalo and stuff like that. And so this was part of this whole sort of drive to make it more Hawaiian rather than sort of generic. So rather than a Hilton hotel, it became a Hilton hotel in Waikiki. And so this was part of the whole process. And part of this was that the decreasing tourist satisfaction with Waikiki and the generic experience, and the state's realization and the agencies, and then of course the business models that realized that you had to have something that was more than, there had to be more value to it than just a place where you could get to the beach. And this was true of all the islands, didn't matter where that hotel was. But the thing was, in this period, is they were also very aware of the fact that the biggest complaint that tourists had were tourists. By the mid-1990s, by 2000, and all the surveys they were doing of tourists, they do them constantly, they were finding the biggest problem that tourists had was the overcrowded nature of tourism. That everywhere they went, there were too many tourists. They had to stand in lines that were too long. They were competing with other tourists. Tourists were rude. Tourists were this, tourists were that. Whereas ironically, it was the same thing the local population was saying about tourists in general. Tourists were also complaining more about other tourists than anything else. And in that context, the state agencies, these two state agencies, came to the conclusion, which was also reinforced from the hotel industry itself, that you were going to have to change how tourism was done here. And at that time, they basically came up to the conclusion that roughly 8.5 million tourists were the maximum that the islands could handle. And what you were going to do is, if that was the maximum, but everyone wanted to keep on making more money, if you're going to limit the number of folks, then what you have to start doing is charge more. So what they came to the conclusion around the turn of the 20th century, 21st century, was that what you were going to do is you were going to target upscale visitors. So you were going to go after folks that had more money, were willing to spend more time here, and therefore you were going to make more, if you want to get sort of crass about it, you were going to make more money off of each tourist. Versus the model prior to that would be what I'd call the Las Vegas model, which is just stuff the buggers, as many buggers as you can, or Walmart model. Walmart and Las Vegas being the same. You just mass and make as much money off of everyone as you can. But you're not going to make very much, but that's okay. You know, there's always 3 more where that person came from. So this was a huge switch in the tourism sector. Was decided what you were going to go is for upscale tourist. Now the tourism sector, specifically Waikiki, but also the other areas, responded to this. And this is what you see when you go to Waikiki with all your huge upscale stores, the redevelopment, God, I totally forgot, the Queen Emma development, International Marketplace, where you got the original one, you come up with a new one that's there now. That was all sort of tied to this logic of the upscale tourist, that you had people who were going to have more money, you wanted them to spend more money here, you had to give them more of a sophisticated, classier experience, and you get rid of the Don Ho tiny bubbles, you know, cheap aloha show on the beach group. And so that was the model. And they figured that was also going to cut back a lot of the protests that were coming from the local population and even the state legislature. The tourists were basically burying the Hawaiian Islands. And a huge part of this, of course, one of the sort of poster children of this was Hanauma Bay, which in the early 2000s period was still had uncontrolled access. And basically the place was dead, you know, it was just a toilet bowl. And so all of this sort of rolled together. So there was this idea that you had to be sort of environmentally responsible, to be socially responsible to the local population, which you wanted to smile and make nice and have aloha for tourists. And at the same time, you wanted to make money without constantly having to build more. All meant that they sort of, you know, coalesced with this idea of upscale tourist. And so that's what the model was. The model was we would max out at 8.5 million tourists, and that would be the same year after year after year. It would provide more attractive experiences. You could charge more, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes that model. And that was basically the marching orders for, from 2002 on. Now, what happened to all that was at the same time that was going on, sort of parallel to it, was this huge change I mentioned before in terms of the resort industry. And that was the change from being owner-built structures. So, for example, the Outrigger Hotel chain, for some reason the name of the family escapes me right now. So they had, I think, 9 hotels here in Hawaii, almost all of them on Waikiki. So that means that they actually built 9 hotels and they own 9 hotels and they manage 9 hotels. And this model is the one that changes right around the early 2000s, whereas what you do is you convert these to condominiums and then you sell those to investors. So what happens is Outrigger now, I think they got rid of their last actually owned and managed hotel. Now what they are is they're a condominium management company. And that's what Hilton is, and that's what Sheraton is, and that's what Disney is, and that's what Trump is. All of these are management companies. So what you did is you took basically about 25 or 30 companies that owned and managed the hotels in the Hawaiian Islands. And that was, of course, the basis for Hawaii Tourism Authority. It was those folks who were like the 800-pound gorillas because they owned all the tourism properties. So if they said, we want this, everyone listened because, of course, they were tourism. They were all the places tourists could stay. And that was the way it had been right until basically 2003. In 2003, when this change started to shift, now they're management companies. So if they're almost like funds managers or CEOs of a publicly shared company. So at that point now what you have is, for example, Disney will just arbitrarily, they've got 130 units out of Daulani. I'm just making this up. Now if you're Disney, you don't own any of those units. You own the building. But now what you have is 130 folks who paid millions of dollars to buy units in your property. And your job is to manage that property, make sure that you can find people to rent those units when the folks aren't staying in them, and otherwise sort of provide ancillary services. But you don't have any investment risk in the building itself, in the sense that you don't own the units. So Disney actually doesn't lose any money if there's no one staying at the Aulani. The investors lose money because that was going to help pay their mortgage. If you're Hilton, they have part of one tower left that's there, but all the other 1,300 or 1,500 or however many units they have, those are all shared by investors. So now Hilton, if suddenly Hilton closes during COVID, okay, that's a bummer, but Hilton's not actually hemorrhaging money because it's not their hotel rooms that they're trying to rent. It's the investors' rooms they're trying to rent. So it's the investors that are hemorrhaging the money. They're the ones that aren't getting any revenue coming in. Hilton gets a cut of that, but it's not near the risk it was before. And of course, once this model showed up, and especially in Hawaii, it was very attractive because people wanted to own places here, and there were enough people globally that were willing to invest, and it wasn't hard to find people to buy these things. There are basically almost no hotels left in Waikiki. Those are all investor owned. So when you look at that, I think it's 7,900 or 8,700 hotel rooms in Waikiki. They aren't really hotels anymore. Because all those 8,700 units, almost without exception, are owned by an individual. So it's actually 87,000 or 8,700, we'll say, folks that own units that are desperately trying to rent them out to folks. Or they have a management company that does that for them, whose name might be Sheraton or Hilton or Outrigger or whomever. So this was the model that occurred, and that's when Trump Tower gets built, and that's when you see all the remodeling in Waikiki. All the new builds down in Waikiki are investors. They're not a company building a hotel in the classic sense. And what that meant is several things, not the least of which, of course, is also in something like Hawaii Tourism Authority, who's basically originally for the purpose of keeping the hotels happy, now finds on one hand, their message is the same. We need to have people. But now what they've got is they've now got probably 11 or 12,000 investors who are constantly screaming that we need warm bodies in our rooms because otherwise we're not going to get our money that we invested into this. We're not going to get our money back that we invested for this room, this condominium in this place called the Hilton Tower 2. So what that means is you no longer have a small group of people who are making a whole mess of decisions. Now what you've got is a group of management companies whose only premise is they have to 100% occupy those rooms to keep their clients satisfied, which is a very different proposition. Before, Waikiki could depend on 75 to 80% occupancy and be happy with that because they were making money, because they were a hotel. Now, if you've got 130 units in your thing, you want 100% occupancy all the time. Why? Because you got 130 investors who all want someone in their room. They don't care if the other rooms are occupied because they're not making any money off of it. So people don't invest in the hotel. They buy a unit. And what that meant is all of a sudden, at the same time the state was talking about leveling off and actually dropping tourism numbers, this new model for how you built resorts and how you use the properties in resorts meant that this was mutually antagonistic. The state was saying that you wanted upscale visitors, but everyone that buys one of these units wants it occupied. So all of a sudden, Hawaii Tourism Authority and the tourism industry is screaming that you need 100% occupancy for us to be successful. And that's on one hand disingenuous because it's not true. And secondly, it's only because you've got, literally thousands of investors who all need something in their unit. So now you've got to keep them all happy. And that just radically changes. And what that did is that just imploded the whole idea of maximizing or putting a ceiling on the number of tourists. Because now you had folks, they weren't interested in local issues, and they weren't interested in the fact that there was an overload of tourism. They weren't interested if tourists were even happy. They just want their unit with people in it, because that's when they make money to pay the mortgage. And so what happened is at that point, the Hawaii Tourism Authority just quietly dropped this whole idea of a ceiling. And by 2005, DBID, who was the one that actually came up with the plan for a ceiling, just pretended it never had happened. You can go back and find these are all public documents, and it's really sort of surreal to watch 2005 and see on one hand these very cogent, very data-driven, satisfaction surveys, and basically what your maximum tourisms are and why. And then all of a sudden by 2006, 2007, it's like that's all been sort of rolled away in an archive. And what you've got now is we need to increase numbers, which is what happened. And that's why till COVID hit last year, we were looking at 11.4 million people. Now that's 3 million more than what the state agencies just 10 years, 15 years earlier had said was the maximum that this place could handle, with everyone being vaguely happy about it. And of course, now they're now talking, if they can get back in gear by early next year, they're talking about getting back to over 11.5. Hopefully, they're saying hopefully 11.7 million people next year, and over 12 million by 2022. So what you get is this infinite ramped up growth model, because the tourism industry has changed radically. You don't have a few large investors. Now what you got is thousands of sort of smaller investors, smaller being in the range of maybe, limit at least $750,000 and upwards of maybe $15 to $20 million per person. But compared to what Hilton originally paid for one of the towers, it's chump change. But that's the new tourism model. And what that means is basically anytime you talk about a cap on tourists, because of the change in the tourism sector, you can't do that. Because the people that own those units will actually not only say it's unfair, but they'll sue you. Because what you've done is that's called restraint of trade. And this gets us to sort of the main point I sort of want to finish up. And that's, at least in my view, well, not me alone, but sort of the view of geographers looking at tourism in Hawaii. There's two main issues. The first is a legal one. We are under American law. We're part of the United States, have been since 1898. And there's two parts that are really key about that. The first is that the United States was built by a group of folks hanging out on the East Coast who basically had, roughly 90% of a continent to their west that, as far as they were concerned, was empty, since they paid no attention to Indians. And so in that view, they built the Bill of Rights and the Constitution off the fact that what you needed to bring in was numbers. They needed more bodies. And so what they did is they basically came up with a premise, which at least to them seemed true at the time, though now it's, of course, incredibly naive, that you had unlimited resources. You had unlimited resources, you had unlimited land. All you needed was enough people and enough motivation to go and find it, shape it, trim it, and make it happen. And so you basically built the Bill of Rights, Constitution, the American legal system on two premises: one, unlimited resources, and two, unlimited opportunities. Now, you see this all the way through the American legal system, and this is also the American value system. And this is why Americans have absolutely no tolerance for someone who's a failure. If you're homeless, if your company goes under, if you end up, even if you get laid off by a company, Americans have no sympathy for you. They dump on your parade because now you're a failure. This is very, very different than almost anyone else. It's a very American thing, but it has to do with the basic mentality of the United States, which is a migrant country. And at the time of people arriving, and even into the mid-19th century, it was largely an empty country. And like Australia, who has a very similar sort of mental attitude, it was designed to basically attract those that wanted opportunity and were willing to take advantage of basically unlimited access to resources or unlimited resources. All you had to do was have the drive and energy to access them. And you see this all the way through what you guys would have taken in American history classes in grade school and high school, the westward migration, settling the Ohio River Valley, even the American Revolution itself. All of this is part of that sort of ethos. Now, in that context, of course, if you base your entire premise of legal rights and everything else, one, on the idea of unlimited resources and opportunity, and then on top of that, in the American system, what you also had was this dominance of the individual, because of course the Americans originally presented themselves in counter to the British Empire, which was the dominance of the group by your landed elite that made up your royal family, etc. in England, who are still pretty much the decision-making group, today in 2020. And so the United States set itself in opposition to that. So what it said is you can't have a group in charge, you have to have individuals in charge. So this becomes what now you would call sort of a libertarian philosophy, which most of the early American designers of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were technically libertarians. So in this concept, individuals have the most rights. The group only has rights when they don't conflict with the individual rights, because the basic premise is individuals will always work what's best for them and by definition for the group, but that's an individual choice. In European and other societies, and certainly in the Pacific, it works the opposite way. The group decides and individuals operate within the mandates of a group or the structure of the group. Not in the American legal system, works the other way. Now, when you combine these two things, and this becomes the American legal system, when we become part of the United States in 1898, this is one reason why there's so much conflict between monarchy law and American law, because the monarchy law was based on a very Polynesian view that the group is more dominant than the individual. The American legal system, right from the Bill of Rights, is very aggressive that the individual has more rights than the group. And you can see this in the meaning of the huge discussion about masks and all sorts of other things. The recent one about having curfews at 10 p.m. is illegal in the United States, which don't ask me where that comes from, but nonetheless, Americans believe it, or at least a proportion do. And that's this idea of the dominance of individualism. And COVID's been a real interesting sort of test of that, of how powerful that logic is. Oftentimes, in sort of, at least from a pandemic approach, sort of rather odd logics. So the idea of individualism and this legal system mean that when you suddenly find yourself one on an island with very limited resources, very limited space, and very congested in terms of population, and you've got tourism as your main revenue stream, then all of a sudden you realize that once you've started tourism, you can't stop it. Because there's nothing you can do to those, we'll say, 130 investors of the Aulani Resort in that Disney has. You can't suddenly tell them, no, we're going to limit the number of tourists because it's better for the local population. So therefore, maybe only 100 of you will have people in your rooms at a time. The other ones are going to class action sue the state of Hawaii, saying that what you were doing is you're restraining their ability to make money, which actually goes against the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And at that point, they're going to say, no, you can't limit anything, because the American system was based on the idea that resources are unlimited. And we're actually both in the state of Hawaii, but actually even nationally, if you look at like issues of water rights and scarcity of water in the mainland, this has become an enormous issue because people are starting to realize the American constitutional system was based on a set of incredibly false premises that don't work at all in the 21st century. And having to figure out how you can change those and still keep the idea of what American is a huge nightmare that people just don't want it. They're just ignoring it. They don't want to deal with it. But a lot of the issues you see at lower levels actually deal with, in a larger scale, with this whole issue that the United States is finite and there are limited resources, and the people with power and money are going to get more than the people that don't have it. And the American constitutional system wasn't set up for that premise. It was set up on the opposite, where if you don't like a system, you just pack and you move west or you move up somewhere else. And at that point, you can then sort of escape what it was you didn't like, and you can still find your future. And of course, the reality is it doesn't work that way. So this is one of the complications you get in Hawaii, is you can have, even if suddenly debed tomorrow, and it's possible they might, given the impacts of COVID, which are real interesting from a research standpoint, they might actually say that, yeah, we were right back in 2005. You should limit it to 8.5 million people. That's all that we can handle here. That's all the population is willing to put up with. And that's it. And what you're going to get is Hawaii Tourism Authority and all those investors are going to just scream. They're going to go, no. And what you're then going to get is a counter argument, which is you guys, as the folks that live here, have just got to be nicer to people and got to put up with aloha because your jobs depend on it. And you just got to suck up with it and just deal with it because life is life. And that's sort of the reality of the irony is that you have a place that's very small, 26 miles by 32 miles around on Oahu. It's very limited in terms of resources. It's already completely out of water. We're already using the waters, I think I mentioned before, we're using the water from 2025 or 2024 this year. So we're actually tapping into our deep water systems. And yet the insistence is that you have to have constantly more tourists. And tourists, by definition, always use more resources on a per day basis because that's part of what tourism is. And if you try to limit them, then they get even more upset. So, you're in a situation where because of the change in the tourism business, tourism itself has radically changed. Now, it's not unique to Hawaii, but it's probably most striking here, just because it's been such a short change. And because of the environmental and resource and just social behavior issues, it's probably more sort of up front and center. But this is probably the massive change that's occurred. Now, on top of that change in terms of those investors, you also have which hit totally everyone out of left field, is the massive increase of the Airbnb industry, which suddenly meant that your residential areas, which were non-tourist, now have become massive areas of tourist use. So your tourism industry isn't limited to those, say 12,000 or 11,000 folks that own units in hotels. You now get the large number of folks that have homes that have either intentionally built part of that home as a sort of mini hotel, i.e. Airbnb, or they're using part of their existing home. And you have to remember one of the paradoxes you get into, and this was seen, for example, out in Kapolei, is that once someone has bought a unit here and they're technically a resident, then they can go and buy other units, even though they're never going to live in them, and they just make the whole things into basically Airbnbs. This is a huge problem in Lanikai, for example. It's estimated that roughly almost 50% of the units out there have no residents in the sense of owners in them. They are purely sort of miniature hotels embedded in residential neighborhoods. And this is one reason why the tourism industry is so aggressive in trying to control the B&B industry, because it's basically, of course, competing with them. But also from the state standpoint, one of the few promises that the state sort of made to the local population was that tourism would be in certain locations. And if you wanted to avoid tourists, you just stay away from those places. And so some of you noted, in fact, in the other class also, that you'd never go down to Waikiki because it's just so touristy, and that was sort of the premise that they held up with till 2007, 2008, when Airbnb suddenly blew up out of nowhere. Now that's not the case. Where I used to live down in Kahala, the house on one side of me had a family that had been there for 40 years. The house on the other side was Airbnb, and every week it was different. And most of the time it wasn't bad, but it was really sort of creepy when you suddenly have people you've never seen, you've never known before, that are there for 3 or 4 days and they're gone. They're replaced by another group. And sometimes, since they were on vacation, they'd be partying until 2 or 3 in the morning and was trying to grade your guys' papers before, during final exams or something. That wasn't good, but there's nothing you can do about it. So we never did figure out who the actual owners there, but they never stayed at that house. That house had become entirely an Airbnb generating, money-making mini hotel, if you want to think of it. This is something that, all of this is something that has to be addressed, but at some point, just like the investors in hotels, under the American legal system, you can't stop this. You can't even control it because that's called restraint of trade. And under the American system, that's the right of what is pursuit of happiness. I can't remember what that phrase in the Bill of Rights is. That constantly gets touted up when you can try to control this. And it doesn't make any difference if you go to court with the argument that you don't have the water, you don't have the resources, and the social stress is going to be too much. That doesn't count in the American legal system. You're dealing with, quote, what they call basic rights in the United States. So at some point, some sort of discussion over that has to happen. But of course, none of that discussion can happen in Hawaii. It all happens back in Washington, D.C. at the federal level. And given the impasse over the last 20 years, this last 4 years have been worse maybe, but the last 20 years have all been symptomatic of this. Even when you bring these discussions up, they go absolutely nowhere. Political partisanship means that no one's ever going to take the long view because everyone wants to get reelected in 2 years. So the result is you're not going to have the type of serious, sort of adult reflective decision making that you have to have. And even if you did have it, it's pretty much a good bet that the constituents would basically, almost shoot the people that tried to do that. So it wouldn't be allowed to happen. So at some point, what you find is our environmental issues here are unsolvable because they're in counter to the American lack of political will, but also the basic structure of the American value system, which is reflected in the legal system. And so, that's sort of a lot of what you look at that we've looked at all semester long sort of parlays into that sort of paradox that you find. Some of the things you can change, though, actually, I'm not sure if you can, I'm not sure if you really tried to really restrict car use here. I wouldn't be too surprised if the car companies wouldn't do some sort of class action lawsuit that, again, was restraint of trade, but maybe not. I'm not sure. Hard to tell. But what you find is that in terms of the things that you can actually do here is, at least at the local and state level, there has to be some real cohesive, comprehensive, and collective discussion about the future. And that's probably the one huge gift that COVID gave us, is by stopping tourism, it gave everyone sort of a pause, where basically it was like being stuck in a corner in a timeout, where everyone was able to look at exactly what were the impacts of tourism, and what does this place look like without tourists. And now that tourists are ramping back in, it's really been really striking. For example, if you're on the roads, for example, as I am, it's been really striking just exactly how traffic changed once you end up with thousands of tourists showing back up in very small numbers by what they were last year. But nonetheless, it's been really striking the type of changes that you see. That has to be pushed, and that has to be a collective enterprise. That has to be the population here, the people that call themselves local, actually in some way, shape, or form having a collective discussion where they need to actually sit down and collectively decide, what is the world you want in 5 years? What is the world you want in 2030? Which is, is not that far away. What is the world you want for your kids? And how do you get there? So first there has to be a sort of discussion about the collective will. And then there has to be a discussion about the roadmap to do it. Till that happens, it's just going to be business as usual. And you can see this classically where the only discussion we're having right now is how to get tourists back. There's no discussion about whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Though I think it's interesting if you look at what Kauai's been up to. They're actually getting pretty aggressive about limiting the number of tourists. But again, at some point, the county doesn't have that legal ability to do that. They just aren't getting any pushback now because it's not that big of an issue at larger levels. And the second, of course, that we can control would be cars. Car dependency, which is different than having a car. Car dependency is an interesting concept because it's a very American concept that you need to have a car. Because when you actually when you ask people why do they need to have a car, for example, if you interview St. Louis students, you find that they need to have a car because that allows them to go where they want to, when they want to. It's not that they actually use it most of the time. In many cases, they just go from home to school to back to home, maybe go shopping a little bit or whatever. But on an actual day-to-day basis, it's not so much that they use it for different things. It's the idea that they can be mindless about it. So when they're done with school, if they're out St. Louis at 2:30 or whatever, they can jump in the car if they decide they want to do something. They can. So it's this idea of freedom. The wheels give you freedom. Wheels give you freedom of choice. And that's, of course, back to this whole individualism thing. But it's also tied into conspicuous consumption. Having wheels means that you have the money to have wheels. It means that you have the money to pay for insurance and gas. So it's a statement of success, which again is that other part of the great American mantra. We need people off of that and replace them with something a little more realistic, especially on a small island. It's going to be hard to do. If we saw, of course, that's what they've done, I think, rather cleverly in Kaka'ako, because you might want to have a car. You might love your car, but if you can't find a place to park your car, you ain't going there. But if you really want to go there, then you have to find some other way to do it than with your car. That model, which is what the high-rise urban models that Kamehameha Schools and Ward and Howard Hughes and other folks are pushing, is very much based on this idea of weaning people off of this. And the interesting thing, if you actually talk to the guys at camp schools that are in charge of planning and development, what used to be Bishop Estate, they're actually adamant that once they see one of the huge problems in this island specifically is the dependency on cars. And part of their idea of the high rises of limited parking is actually intentionally, and they're very open about this, that the only way you're going to get people off of their car addiction is to make it impossible for them to have a lot of cars. And so they actually see this as part of their way to deal with what they call their legacy, which of course is to keep the Hawaiian Islands intact, because that's what Princess Pauahi wanted them to do. And part of it is to generate money to pay for the school. But they, by about 15 years ago, they came to the realization that if you bulldozed and paved over the entire island, you might still have a CAM schools, but there's no reason to live on this island because their life would be so shitty here, it wouldn't be worth the trouble. So they came to the conclusion that they were going to have to help preserve a lifestyle that made Hawaii an attractive place to live, as part of their legacy, along with the revenue generation to keep the school running. And they've seen that the one thing that they can really focus on in a very meaningful way is reducing the use of cars. So there are things that folks can do, and it's not that hard, but it's a very different way of looking. The great advantage to car dependency, you've actually got a lot of other places in urban areas in the world, Hong Kong, any of the Tokyo urban areas, etc., including large areas of Europe, Paris, London, etc., where you see active and actual very sophisticated ways of dealing with addressing car dependency and how you change people's attitudes and the different clever models you can use, most of which could apply equally easily here. But then you're going to get, as with anything, you're going to get pushback from people that say, well, I have to have my car. And you certainly would from, UH is probably the most famous example of this in terms of students that have automobiles that they don't do much with. The number of Chaminade students want to have a regular year to live in the dorms here on campus and drive the car down to Long's, the shopping center, literally almost across the street, because that's too far to walk, is legion, and that's car dependency. So, those are the two that you can address. Some of the larger sort of national discussion points, you can't. It's part of the American legal system, but those are all sort of, where we're at in the 21st century. And as from a geographer standpoint, again, sort of remember that on one hand, COVID's been a huge shock. On the other hand, what we should be doing here is actually researching, now that you've actually got a pause, what were the impacts of tourism and how can you see the changes? Those of you involved in environmental studies might have seen the state reports that they've been putting out about the huge change at Hanauma Bay in terms of the reintegration of fish moving back in and even coral regrowth, simply because you had basically 7 or 8 months of no one there, which is very different than the way it was last year, where you basically had numbers of people there, but you'd capped it, which turns out to be very different than no one, which, to be honest, we didn't know, because there's no way you could have done that study until all of a sudden, ironically, this outside agency just comes in and just shuts down tourism. There should have been, and it's too late now, some study done, for example, of reef regrowth and fish repopulation of places like Waikiki, which would have been a great study to do, but now it's too late because everyone's starting to come back. So there are a lot of potentials out there. It's not that it's a disaster per se, but it really is something that involves, a lot of discussion and perception of place. And just sort of last, when you look at this, the classic image that's important, probably the most important to think of all this when you're looking at it, is the fact that here's the continental United States. When the original legal system was built, the entire American legal presence was only 150 miles in from the eastern seaboard. So Lily was the coastal area of this part of the East Coast. Didn't include down there. This belonged to the French. This was all British and French. And this belonged to no one but the Spanish down here and Indians up here. So, you could, and then even in the early 19th century, basically say, go west, young man, and find your future. We, on the other hand, are an incredibly small piece of islands. We're completely, it's further from here to here than it is almost completely across the United States. So we have absolutely no geographical reference to tie us to the United States. That's a result of 19th century geopolitics and our place in the Pacific, which is sort of uniquely almost betwixt and between everything, means that our view of the world is actually in many ways what the rest of the world has to come to, because they can't see it. The mainland can't see limited resources because the place is so big, it's hard to visualize it. On an island, you can actually look at the island of Oahu and you can say, yeah, there's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of this, there's not a lot of that. And you can actually show people, and they can actually visually and conceptually understand it because it's small. So in some ways, you could see us as the, what happened there? As the exemplar. You know, we become sort of the test case, if you would, for environmental discussions that are occurring globally, just because it's such a small group of islands. And that means that gives us a huge advantage in being able to have these discussions. It also means that, you know, we're much more at risk in terms of screwing it up because there's no place to go. You can't move from LA to you can move from LA to San Francisco. You can't move from Oahu to an island out here because there ain't nothing out there. So, you know, our environmental issues are ours. Our legal construction is not ours. And coming to some sort of discussion about that is going to be, you know, really, you know, critical in say the next 5 or 10 years, because that's going to literally define whether these islands, especially Oahu, remain inhabitable or not, since the water is already a huge problem. So that's my dog and pony for the semester. Guess it wasn't as cheerful as I was trying to do. Okay. Any questions? Last comments?